In this video, I want to give you a tutorial for our second practical assignment. So in this video, we're going to start with part one, where I'm just going to show you very briefly how to do the snapshot. In case you're not familiar with how to do that in Google, it's very easy. It'll only take a minute. By the way, it's so much easier to clone machines, copy machines in virtualized environments, right? And even building machines in Google. We could have just built another machine. It probably wouldn't take that much longer. So then after that, we're going to install VSFTP, which is an FTP server. We're going to use that to test some security settings, right? We're not really learning about FTP. We're just using it as a test. And then we're going to install an FTP client on our client machine. And we're going to test to make sure FTP works. And then we're going to use a firewall to lock down FTP. So we're going to use a firewall to basically block FTP so we can't connect and test it. And then we're going to adjust that firewall to allow FTP, right? By default, your firewall allows everything. So we're going to change it to block everything, make sure that works, and then just kind of surgically add the port that we want for FTP and make sure that works. Then I'm going to show you a little bit about mandatory access control, so the built-in tool in Linux, which is SELinux, and that'll be the practical assignment. So the first step in the lab is to make a snapshot. And you can see I've already made a snapshot in my system. And the way you're going to do this, you're going to go to, so I'm in the compute engine, so I click my hamburger, and I'm going to scroll down under compute engine. One of the options in here is going to be snapshots, right? So I'm going to click on snapshots, and it's going to bring up a different page here. So from the snapshots, basically, you can see I've got one snapshot right now that I've already taken, but if I wanted to create a new snapshot, I just click the Create Snapshot button up here at the top. And I'm going to go in here, fill out a name for my snapshot, and select the system that I built in the first lab, right? So I select that system, and then I create that snapshot. Once that snapshot is created, if I go to my VM instances, if you click on Create Instance, instead of creating a machine from scratch, you'll be able to create a machine. You'll be able to give it a name just like you normally would, just like you did in the previous lab. Be sure to set up a N1 micro, right, like I walked you through in the other lab. But down here, when it asks you for the disk, instead of selecting CentOS, instead you're going to go over here to snapshots, and you're going to choose the snapshot that you created. So I can create a brand new snapshot here. So one of the first things we're going to do is install VSFTP on our server. So we have two machines. One machine's the server. That's the one that you built in the original lab. The second machine is your client, which is what we're going to use in this lab to connect to our server to test, right? So we need a client to test. And we want to do that from a machine that's within the Google, within Google space, right? So that we're on their network and we don't have to set up a firewall on Google just to keep the lab simple. We don't want to poke holes in the Google firewall, right, to do our labs. So in any event, I'm going to connect to my server first, right? So you should recall how to do this from the first lab. So I'm going to put in my password. And we're connected. One of the first things I do is I usually run su, but the directions, instead of having you run su, instead we're going to use the sudo command. So you're just going to type sudo space, and we need to install vsftp. So it's going to be install, or yum install vsftpd. Don't forget the D on the end. I have to put my password in. And it's going to go out and see if it can find that package. We talked about the package manager a little bit in the lecture. Do I want to install this package? Yes, I do. Right, so it's going to go ahead and install that package. And now I've got that package installed. So the next thing I want to do is make sure that the service is there. So once again, I got to use sudo because I have to run this as root. So the systemctl command is how we're going to manage services. In this case, we want to list unit files. So this is going to tell us all the services that are set up on our system. But I only want services, so I'm going to use the type. Don't forget 2 hyphens there, right? I think I had that mistyped in my directions for a while, but it's been fixed. So it's going to give us a list of all of our services. One of them that we should see in this list is going to be VSFTP. So as I page through by using my space bar, and I'm going to see VSFTP right there. Right now it is disabled, right? So the first thing we're going to need to do is enable that service. So to do that, first thing we want to do is go in and take a look at our config file. So again, we're going to use sudo. I'm going to use the vi utility, which you should have learned about in your previous course. And most of our config files are in etc. In this case, vsftpd is the directory, and the file that we are going to edit is sftp.conf. So this should open up the config file. And you can take a look at these various options in the config file. And we're not going to change any of these. We're just going to go with the default. But definitely take a look at some of these. I'm going to ask you some questions about these in the lab. So to get out of VI, I'm going to hit escape. I'm going to hit the colon, WQ, bang, or exclamation point. That takes me back to my original command. So now I want to make sure, now I want to try starting VSFTP, right? Because we're going to need to use it. So again, it's going to be systemctl command to start a service. Start vsftpd. That should start the service. If you want to see if it's actually running, I'm going to use the status function. There we go. So we can see it's actually running. We want to make sure that this service runs every time we restart the machine, so we don't have to always restart it. So I'm going to use enable. And now, because I've enabled it, I should be able to go back to that command that we ran to look at all the services. And if I scroll through here, you can see that VSFTP service is actually enabled now. All right, now that you have installed VSFTP, we saw a little bit about services, right? So now let's talk a little bit about processes first. We'll start with that. So if I run the PS command, just straight PS command, no, I'm not logged in any special privileges. You can see there's only 2 processes running. Bash is my command prompt that I'm in right now, right? So that's from what, that's where I'm running all my commands in Bash. And I just ran the PS command, so that one pops up as well, right? The PS command has other options. So for example, I can do -ef. Oops, I didn't mean to type it twice. So I get a lot more options when I run PS-EF. Let's see, another option I have in the instructions to try PS-EJH. So that shows us the process tree. What's cool about the process tree is now I can see the relationship of all my processes, right? So I can see systemd, and then within systemd, I've got all these other processes, and network manager's running, and within network manager, DHCP client, master, and within that, queue manager, pickup. I've got SSHD running, and within that, there's other spawned SSHDs. And actually, this one right here is my session right now, right? I can tell because I just ran the PS command, right? So I'm running inside master. I'm running SSH. There's my session. There's bash command. And from within bash, I ran the PS command. And you can see down here at the bottom, VSFTP is running. So let's see, another thing we can do here. By the way, in my instructions, I have you run this with the less command. And the reason I do that is that way you can scroll up and down through this list. It doesn't scroll off the screen, right? So now I can see all these different processes. You can see, at the root is K thread, and below that is everything else I'm running. Systemd is also one of the root processes. Okay. All right. So I'm going to hit Q to quit that. So when you use the less command, you can use Q to quit. So another thing we could do, and I forgot to take a note of it, right? But the VSFTPD is running with process ID 30884, right? So if I run the kill command, so I can type kill and then put in the process thread, or the process ID is 308, and it says operation not permitted because I need to be running as root, right? So if I run as root, it should have worked, right? So now if I run that previous command, PS-EJH, and I scroll all the way to the bottom, I should no longer see VSFTP. If you're not sure, because it's a long list, one of the other things you could do is pass this into grep, and you can search for VSFTPD, and nothing shows up because it's not running. And just to show you how this works, right, if I do systemd, for example, right, it shows me all the systemd stuff that's running. Or I can look for SSHD, right? It shows me the different trees for SSHD. So now we know VSFTP isn't working. We have to go ahead and start it again. Actually, we can check the status of it, right? So if we run systemctl, status VSFTPD, and we can see that right now it's not running. And if I change this to start, it should go ahead and start it for me. Oh, looks like authentication, right? So I have to put in my password. Forgot about that. There we go. Failed to start, access denied, because I need to use sudo, right? So we'll try this again. Systemctl start vsftpd. And I think that worked, right? So now if I do status, I can see that it's now running. So now we can see that it's running. So we basically looked at processes. We were able to see the service. We were able to restart that service after we killed it. And you saw how to use that kill command. One that I don't have in the lab that I think is worth showing you is top, right? So top shows you all your processes. And you can kill processes from here as well. You can just hit the K button. It'll ask you which process do you want to kill. Of course, I'm not going to kill anything, right? Because I don't want to do that. But I'm going to hit Q to get back to my command. So now we want to take a look at the firewall. And we're just going to do some basic firewall configurations in this lab. But in order to do that, we need to use our client. So I'm going to bring up my other SSH session. And this is the client system. So this is the one that I cloned in the beginning of the lab and created that client machine. So once I log in, I put the wrong password in. Give it a second here. So the first thing we need to do, and again, I'm just going to use the su command so that I'm running as root and I don't have to keep putting my password in. So now you can tell your root when you have the hash sign in your prompt, although you can modify that if you want to. But we're going to use the yum command to install an FTP client. It's real basic, FTP client. This is how we're going to connect to VSFTP to copy a file. So let's go ahead and run this. It's going to ask me if I want to install it. I'm going to say yes. And you can't see the at the bottom, but there's my prompt. So now we should have the FTP client. So if I type the FTP command, it works, right? Let me go ahead and exit from that. So the first thing I want to do is I need to create a file, right? So I'm going to do that with VI. I'm just going to create a file, VI, create a file called myfile.txt. I'm going to hit I to insert. This is a file. I'm going to use WQ to save it. So now I have a file, right? If I use the ls command, I can see my myfile.txt. So now I'm going to copy that file to my other machine, right? So once we've installed FTP, the FTP command, we can run the FTP command. So that's FTP, then the IP address of your server. If you're not sure of the IP address, you can see over here I use the ifconfig command, right? So type ifconfig on your server, and it will give you your IP address. You could use the host name as well. It should work in Google using the host name, but I'm going to go ahead and use the IP address. You can see here the name. It's trying to log in as root. I don't want to log in as root. I want to log in as student. Let me put my password in. Now, of course, I would not be able to log in as a student, right? Because or as root rather, because we don't allow that, right? That config file says do not allow login as root. But now that I'm logged in, you can run regular commands like you would on the other machine, right? So I run the ls command, and by the way, dir works as well, right? They're both standard FTP commands. The command to copy a file up to the server is put. So if I type put myfile.txt, which is a file that I created earlier, it's going to transfer it, and that's it. The file has now been copied to the other machine, and if I go back over here and I type the ls command, you can see that myfile.txt has been copied up to my home directory on this machine, right? So it worked. It copied the file. You can see I did another one earlier, FTP test file. That's what I did when I created the instructions. So now that we know we can connect to that server, now we're going to take a look at on the server at the firewall and see if we can block FTP, right? So in the lecture, if you recall, the IP tables command, and actually before I do that, I'm going to make sure I'm running as root, because a lot of this stuff will not work unless you're running as root. So we're going to use the su command to log in as root. So the IP tables command is going to show me my firewall rules on my server, right? So you can see here I've got all my firewall rules. By the way, if it goes by too fast, you can use the less command so you can see it, right? So you can see here it's accepting everything coming into my machine, right? So it's pretty straightforward. Not a lot going on here. Now, IP tables can be a bit confusing to set up. So in this lab, I figured what we would try is using a utility to do this. And firewall-cmd is the utility that we use. So if you type firewall-cmd, right? I'm sorry, firewall-cmd. So firewall-cmd is the utility that we can use to work with our firewall. You can see if I just type that, it's probably not going to do anything, right? We have to actually pass some options for it. So the first option we're going to take a look at is get zones. And this is going to list all the zones that we have to work with. So mine has the zones block, DMZ, drop, external, home, internal, public, trusted network, or trusted and work. So which one of these is the zone that I'm using right now? So to see the current active zone, I'm going to do get active zone. So that tells me that right now my active zone is trusted. So right now I'm using the trusted zone. So what I could do here, if we wanted to try to play around with the firewall, let's take a look at all of the zones again, or take a look at rather what public or what's allowed in the public zone, right? So I want to look at what we can actually do with these different zones. So we're going to use list all. So the list all command is going to basically give us all the rules for the zone, and you have to indicate which zone you want to look at. So I'll start with trusted, right? So if we look at the trusted zone and take a look at the rules that we have. So trusted is just going to accept everything, right? There's no rules, you know, everything is allowed. Just accept everything, right? However, the public zone is basically don't allow anything, right? So everything is shut down except for two things. DHCP v6 is allowed and SSH is allowed. Right? And most of the zones will allow SSH because we can't access our server to manage it without SSH. So Google by default, when you build your machine, they make sure that all your zones have SSH. I think almost all the zones do. So our next step here is we want to set our default zone to public, right? So let's run the command again, and we're going to change the zone. So the command for that is set default dash zone equals public. All right, so success. So it should have set the default zone. We can double check, look at the active zone. We can see that it's public, right? So now that I've done that, and we know that that zone is pretty secure, we should not be able to access this machine from the client, right? So if I go over here to my FTP client and I try to connect again, look what happens. Connect, no route to host, right? So it doesn't allow me to connect. So we know the firewall is working. It's now blocking that traffic. All right, so our next task is let's go ahead and try to add FTP to our public zone so that we can allow FTP traffic. We know we want to use FTP, so we want to allow the traffic, right? So to do that, we are going to add a service to that zone. So again, it's the firewall-cmd command. And this time we are going to, for the public zone, we are going to add a service, and we're going to set the service to FTP. Now the way this works is there's a list of services that are mapped to ports. So you could add a service, but you could also add a specific port. So you don't necessarily have to use a service. And one of the things that we talk about in the lecture and when we talk about firewalls is this idea of port hiding, where some people run services on odd port numbers. But there's also times that you have services that are not well known, that don't have a well-known port that's configured in the firewall, so you have to either add a service to firewall-cmd or just add a rule for a specific port or a range of ports, right? So now that we've done that, we're still running in the public, I'll go back here and look at our active zone, which is public. And now if I come back over here and we try to connect with FTP again, now it works, right? I'll log in just to make sure it works. There we go. So now we're logged in. I can see the list of files that are on my server, and everything works now. So now we know how to set up our firewall, and we can leave it set up with the firewall now, and it's very restrictive now. It's only going to allow SSH, FTP, and DHCP v6, which you could remove if you wanted to, but it's a good idea to have that running. One of the other security tools we have, just one of the basic components in Linux, is SELinux. There's a different package in some other distros, but in CentOS and Red Hat, we have SELinux. This is what we use for mandatory access control. By default, Linux is discretionary access control, meaning that that users create their own objects and they can do whatever they want with them, right? They can decide who gets access to the objects that they create or the files that they create. Whereas with SELinux, this is a way of enforcing controls that's beyond the user's control, right? So it's mandatory access control. Lots of different settings in there. But one of the first things we want to check when we're in a Linux system is we want to see if SELinux is actually running. So, and I'm sorry, I meant to put get enforce here, not set enforce. So if I do a get enforce, you can see that right now we're enforcing. Enforcing means that it's enforcing all of the policies with SELinux. I can also turn it off, right? So I can do a set enforce 0, and that's essentially going to, it goes to permissive mode, which means that essentially SELinux is not running, right? Why would we want that? Well, sometimes when you're troubleshooting, this is the most common way I use it, is I know that SELinux is probably blocking something, but I want to verify if it's SELinux or if there's something else going on. So I'll set SELinux to permissive mode, try whatever it is I want to try and see if it works. If it works, I know that there's a setting somewhere in SELinux to allow that activity. But if it still doesn't work, I know that I've got something else wrong that I have to go and fix. Maybe a value in a config file or the service isn't running or something along those lines. So the question is, like, what are all these settings? So if you look at get SEBool, this is going to show you all the settings, and you can use -A to view them all, right? So this is going to show you all the settings in SELinux. There's a lot of them here, so generally you're going to want to only show certain ones. I could use the less command to kind of scroll through them all, but again, there's a lot of them. Now, we just installed FTP, so I'm going to use grep to show all the ones associated with FTP. So you can see here we've got some settings that are geared towards FTP. So for example, I could turn off, I have anonymous write turned off in SELinux. I could turn that on to allow anonymous write, right? The default position is off, right, which is probably more secure. So if I do set SEBool, and let's see, it's FTPD _ anon write, and we're going to turn it, we're going to turn it on, right? And now if I do a get SEBool, it should tell me the value is on right now, right? So now it's turned on. In fact, if I look at it this way, it's also on here as well, right? So now it'll allow anonymous write in FTP, which is generally not a good idea. Most of the time I'm going to turn that off. But there's other settings, right? There's tons of settings in here. Another one that's probably very frequently that you'll use in the real world is HTTP, right? There's tons of settings for Apache. HTTPD is the Apache daemon, right? So you can go in here and set some settings for Apache. I will tell you, I think the FTP settings that you just saw, some of them probably don't apply to VSFTP. It kind of does its own security. It's for a different FTP daemon, but so these are really geared towards specific daemons and services or processes. But again, it's good to be familiar with what's in here. And sometimes you can add modules to SELinux. So you might download a package. Let's say you downloaded MySQL, right, which is a really common open source database engine. Let's say you installed MySQL on your machine. There's probably MySQL SELinux policies that you can add to the machine. So a module that you would add for SELinux that adds those policies. And in fact, if you run the package manager to install MySQL or MariaDB or PostgreSQL or something like that, a lot of times they automatically add those modules as if they're dependencies. And then you'll have those options to set them. So again, lots of cool things in SELinux we can use to secure our system, and this relates to mandatory access control. So that concludes the lab for this unit. If you have any questions, please let me know, and hopefully the tutorial helped you get through the lab.